Hello and welcome to This Is Not an Episode, a weekly-ish podcast where we talk about what's going on in the world of philosophy. I'm Jonathan Tallant. I am a philosopher. Andy, who are you?
I'm Andy Fisher, and I'm also a philosopher.
Which is handy given we're going to talk about philosophy. What have you been up to, Andy? What's been going on?
Oh, lots of very high level academic stuff and things that really sticks into my mind is I went to see Wicked 2 at the cinema last night.
Oh, did you? Was it any good?
It was good. There's debate in my family about if the first or second was better. I think the first was a little bit better. It was at least more upbeat, but the second one was very good as well. I mean, the set design and the aesthetics was amazing. So it was fun, a fun outing. What about you? What have you been up to?
Well, I seem to have not been going to the cinema to watch anything. To be honest, I'm just hanging on until we make it to Christmas at this point. I will not claim to be achieving anything that's massively highbrow, just clinging on for grim death until we get there at this stage, I think.
Yes, I can understand that.
Yeah. But alongside all of your cinema going, and I assume that basically now, Andy, you just go to the cinema and don't do anything else. But you've been messing about with robots. What have you been doing, Andy?
That's a very good question. And I have been messing about with robots. So the Jonathan and myself, well, don't say Jonathan, you and me have been working on some stuff around philosophy of education for a bit. And some of the claims we make, and we can drill down to what they are, make sort of empirical claims about how things would work in the real world. And I think we thought that testing some of these claims out would be an interesting thing to do. So that's a long way of saying, and therefore we worked with a Cobot co-making lab in Jubilee campus in Nottingham who have loads of some robots. And we put a robot in front of some first year philosophy students in a lecture. And the robot was pre-programmed to talk about metaphysics of time. Jonathan, you wrote that, which, it's great. It showed slides and it answered questions. And we were very interested to know what that might tell us about education and some various elements of that. We've got a whole load of data in, which is really exciting, and we need to spend time to go through that. We've had a quick look, but yeah, so that's the idea.
Cool. So let me. I realise I do know what's going on here, but let me step it back a little bit, because you talked there about there being some philosophy of education work that we've done that has these kinds of empirical implications, and that's why we put the robots in front of these first years. Should just clarify that all of the first years survived. There were no incidents involving robots. But take us back to the beginning, Andy. What sort of things were we saying that about philosophy of education that mean there might be some some downstream consequences?
Yeah. So two broad themes. I'll mention one, then it'll be good. I'm interested to know what you think. Explain the other one. But for us, I think we're interested in what teaching is. So I mean, it sounds very simple, as all things do in philosophy, right? The question, what is it? What's going on when someone is teaching? Now, that's not the same question as what makes a good teacher. That's a fascinating topic, but it's not something we were particularly interested in. But trying to identify what teaching is. So to try and problematize this a bit, it looks like teaching is not directly related to learning. You can learn things without being taught them. So I can trip over something and learn that I shouldn't walk across that space because there's a wire there or something. So I can learn that. But no, the wire hasn't taught me anything. And there's various debates in the literature about what actually counts as teaching. Some people say that the sort of apparent teacher has to have the intention for teaching the students certain things, but you can construct experiments. And one thought experiments that we've got is that imagine an actor who has got a gig as a teacher in a sort of a film about like School of Rock or something. And they go along and their intention is to follow the script and to look good on camera, not to teach. But as in all good philosophy experiments, they go into the wrong space and it's a genuine school. And so they go through the motions and intend to look really good on camera. They're not intending to teach. They're just doing what an actor does. And the students are learning lots of cool stuff. on that, it doesn't look obvious that the teacher, there's no teaching going on in that space. And on the other side, it looks like you can be teaching without people learning. I mean, I think that's pretty much most of my teaching, what happens in most of my modules. But you can imagine a really, really complex quantum physics lecture where people are going, wow, they're really trying really hard teaching us stuff, but I don't understand what's going on. So, or other famous example is, a swim teacher who spends the whole semester trying to get students to learn how to swim, yet they still drop to the bottom. So there's no learning going on there, or at least it's not obvious that it is. But you still want to say the teaching's happened. So now we've got a problem, right? So teaching looks like it's not to do with outcomes, i.e. how much people have learned, and teaching not to do particularly with intentions, because we can construct our cases where intuitions are teachings happen, but the intention wasn't there. So then the real question is, what's left? And we've got this view that we say that teaching is a judgment dependent concept. So what that means is that the correct application of someone saying that teaching is happening, the correct use of that is determined by the judge, the person who's making that claim, under certain conditions. So if someone's doing some stuff in front of me, and the lighting is good, there's no noise disruption, I'm not drunk or high or any of those things, and I think, oh, that teaching's happening, then teaching has happened. That's all that amounts to. Now, of course, what that raises is some interesting questions about, well, does that mean anything can teach, right? Can teaching happen for anything? So could a robot, for example, be a teacher? And I thought, well, we think, yes, that just follows from what we think, but let's find out. So putting students in front of a robot and asking them, would you judge this as teaching you? How does this relate to learning these other things? And then seeing from that what it might tell us. And it was quite open in the sense that we're just really interested to see what the data says.
Yeah.
That's a long ramble, Jonathan, but that sets the scene a bit.
I think that's really good, Andy. So we've got this kind of, I guess, a couple of different things. We've got all that existing theory in the philosophy of education that says thus and so needs to happen in order for teaching to have occurred. And I guess one thought is that by putting a robot in front of people and asking whether or not there's some teaching going on, we're kind of testing those theories a little bit.
Yeah.
But then also we have that judgment dependent view of ours, as you say, which we've defended in print, where we're saying that teaching happens if you judge it does, roughly. And so that would suggest that that would suggest that it might be possible for robots to teach them, and that's kind of interesting. So stick some people in front of a robot and see whether or not they think they're being taught. Is that a fair summary?
That's a very fair summary. And once for all our many listeners,
for both people who are listening,
if you start to really think about what you're doing, when you're saying something someone's teaching, it's really interesting, right? What is going on? I mean, how does it relate to education in general, learning? Can someone be teaching you but you not be taught something? So all these things come apart, and as good philosophers, we like to do that. We like to pull this apart. So not only the conceptual work is interesting, but just interesting to see what actual students say. So some of the sort of headlines from the data, I've got the data in front of me. So when we asked these students lots of questions, but we said, do you think that the robot was teaching you during the lecture? And 15 people, which is 47%, say yes, 28% say no, and 25% say not sure. So that's interesting. But what's interesting is just this puts direct pressure on one of the theories. Do you think that you learned anything from the lecture? And 53 plus 38% say, yeah, I learned something.
Yeah.
So that's interesting, right? So there's some kind of link between learning and how they understand teaching, and we've given them open comments as well, which ask them to reflect on what the experience was like. And they interestingly reflect on things like, they need to be human, but without any justification, just like a view on that, or they need to be more interactive. I remember, because we did the focus groups afterwards, the good thing, which was, this robot was monotone and not very interesting, but better than some of my lecturers. So there's some headline things. I don't know if you've got any questions around any of that stuff, but.
Well, I think I should just clarify that the comment from the focus group, they did go on to say by lecturers they meant people at college, not at the university.
Absolutely, yes. It wasn't a particular.
They really did say that as well.
Yes, they did. Yes. Yeah.
Just to try and preempt anything. I mean, I guess that, as you said, the data is in some way really interesting. Do you believe the robot was teaching you during the lecture? Just under half say yes. Just under a third say no, and then just a tiny bit less than that say not sure. I guess if you're thinking about that in the context of all of that thinking that you outlined a minute ago, yes, around we've got our judgment dependent view, there's the intentional view, there's all these other different views. What would you then say? How would you interpret the data? I know we haven't had a chance to dig into it and really do the investigative work yet, but just superficially, are we happy with this data in terms of it supporting us? Are we worried about what it says? What's your thinking?
I think what's interesting is that first off, that teaching doesn't just track humans. I think that's just an interesting point. So that leaves space for asking, well, given that we don't think, well, we'll have to look at the comments, but you might assume they haven't got minds and not intending to teach us stuff, then it challenges that. But I guess it does open the question that we'd have to answer, which is, well, if some judge that teaching is happening and some judge teaching is not, does that sort of mess up with our view? So how can it be that someone's teaching and someone is not teaching at the same time? And I think we can give answers to that, because we don't think there's a sort of objective fact that we're having to track and get right. But it certainly raises interesting questions about the relationship between teaching and learning, the relationship between intention, because, I guess.
And I come back to some of the other stuff on judgment dependence, because you were saying there that there are things that we can say in response to the idea that some people think that teaching was going on and others don't. And one of the things that I know that we've talked about before, not on the podcast, but we've talked about before, is the comparison with something being funny. Now, pretty arguably, there's no objective standard as to whether or not some joke or so on is funny. It's very much in the eye of the beholder. If some people think it's funny, some people think it isn't, they're both in a sense right. They're just working to different standards, I guess, internally. And I suspect that the direction that you're going in there, Andy, was very much one where we're saying, well, whether or not someone is teaching is a bit like whether or not something is funny. It's a judgment dependent kind of the thing. And so some of those students were taught, others weren't. And that, despite the fact that they were both in the same room, in the same circumstances, in the presence of the robot being delivered the same script. And that's a kind of an interesting result, right? But I guess the first question for me is, have I correctly guessed where you were going with that? And then I'll follow up in a second.
Yeah, that seems right. I think with the caveat, which was, I don't want people to think this is some kind of relativism, in the sense that, I mean, even with funny, you might think there is some stuff where we just agree that's not funny, and you can specify the context so that people just agree. So it's not like everything it can be funny, arguably. But even if it is the case, I wouldn't want to draw the direct parallel to that, because some things just can't be teaching. Like if you just put a fish tank in front of the class, that's not teaching at all, right? And how do I know that? Well, because the students wouldn't judge under any conditions that fish tank could be teaching. Now, it is true, it's certainly true that our account says if they do judge it, then the fish is teaching them. But as a matter of fact, they won't. So that's the line. It's so you have the point about funness, but with that caveat where we can get more convergence and rule out some of the relativistic worries, I think.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, it's a nice way to try and avoid the pernicious slides to relativism, he says, offending relativists everywhere. Were there any other bits of the data that jumped out at you?
There was something about, like I say, I've only just really opened this up. So there was stuff about trust, but I think I'd like to hand over to you about trust, because this is your big, one of your many big things that you're interested in and research on. So what's the trust side of things here, and why should philosophers be interested in trust, and why is it an issue that we should be interested in trust? Trust is just trust, right?
Yeah, absolutely. Trust is just trust, and we can all stop, and that's fine. I think for me, my entry point to this is thinking about a lot of philosophical theories of trust that really look like they treat it as being an interpersonal kind of a relation. So to pick up on some of the ideas, that the thought is something like, I trust you to do something, or this is Catherine Hawley's idea, I trust you to do something if I rely upon you to do it, and I believe that you're committed to doing that thing. So I trusted you to turn up for this podcast because I was relying on you to do so, and I also believe that you were committed to doing so. Now, think about then all kinds of interactions that we have with inanimate objects or non-persons. Do I believe that the computer is committed to recording this? No, it doesn't have commitments. Does the table that I'm resting on have any commitments? No. Do I trust it to take my weight? No. In fact, I just can't, because it's the wrong kind of thing to have commitments and so on. And a lot of philosophical theories about trust build that kind of interpersonal bias into them. Trust is an interpersonal attitude. But if you look at the way that we talk about trust a lot, you find people saying things like, well, I trust my car to get me home. I trusted the taxi to, well, maybe a taxi would be a bad example because there'd be a person involved. I trusted maybe I do trust the computer to finish the recording of this. And then there's a bit of backwards and forwards amongst philosophers about what does trust mean the same in both contexts? Does it mean something else? And of course, you might think that this is then an empirically tractable question, right? You could ask people about whether they really are trusting the thing, whether they're just relying on something. And so robots form a really interesting kind of subclass for consideration here, because we get people talking about trusting artificial intelligence all the time. We get people talking about trusting robots in particular contexts. So you might think about robots operating in a care home. If you don't really trust the robot, then you're probably in the care home, you're probably not going to allow it in, or you're going to require particular standards to make sure that it's operating in a particular sort of a way. So there's a lot going on in there about what trust is, why it matters, and whether or not we can trust agents that are not humans. And so one of the things that we did, as well as asking the philosophy students about whether or not they thought the robot was teaching them, we asked them whether or not they trusted it, and a bunch of kind of related questions. And yeah, I mean, some really interesting results coming out.
Yeah, I'll ask you a little bit about that in a minute. So I just the thing that struck me when you're speaking was, is there a sort of middle thing? So you talked about the care home where you've got trust and then distrust, perhaps, is the opposite. I don't know. But is there just a neutral category here?
Yeah, there has to be. So it's really, really fun, because it's one of the great things about one of Catherine Hawley's papers, Trust, Distrust and Commitment. She's one of the first philosophers to really, if not the first philosopher, to lean on the idea that distrust isn't just the absence of trust. Right. It's actually something a little bit more pernicious than that. So, I trust you, Andy, but if I met someone in the street, I probably wouldn't really trust them or distrust them. I'd just be pretty neutral towards them. And then there are people that I distrust to do particular kinds of things. Yeah. And so, yeah, there is a middle ground, and arguably, in fact, there's a continuum rather than just three points on the scale.
Does this is fascinating to me. I don't know all the literature like you do. I'm going to ask about education in a minute, but I want to just sort of bottom out some of these things. So with the people who talk about that interpersonal element being needed, does this relate to animals as well? So you trust the horse. I don't know. I don't travel around by horse, but you can imagine the jockey being trusting the horse or whatever.
Yeah, so it should do, and I've put it in interpersonal terms, but I think if you judge the agent that if you judge the thing that you were trusting to be an agent and you thought it had commitments, then those kinds of philosophical views would end up with the result that yes, the jockey did trust the horse to carry them safely and so on.
Is it a judgment dependent account then?
So you've got to be relying on them as well. There's a success condition there, and then you've got to believe that they have commitments. So I'm not strictly sure it comes out as being judgment dependent, because whether or not you judge that you're trusting someone is, I guess, kind of orthogonal to the question of whether you do trust them.
Yes.
If you are relying on it and you believe that they have a commitment to doing the thing, then you trust them.
Yeah. Okay, that makes sense. But what's all this got to do with classroom practice and teaching and stuff? Can you explain that a bit?
Yeah, of course. So there's loads of really fun empirical work that's been done to show that where you get high levels of trust in a school environment or high levels of trust in a classroom, then education flows much more naturally. People learn more, people perform better, teachers perform better, pupils do better, they feel happier, more content, and so on and so forth. Of course, my philosopher's question is, when they're asking those, they're doing that empirical work, are they really talking about trust, or are they talking about something else? But at least the empirical literature's findings seem to be, where you get high levels of trust, you get a really positive educational experience. So there's something in here that really matters to educate, or should matter to educators, as well as being an interesting philosophical question about, well, which thing really is trust, which thing isn't? And of course, if you can settle that question, you can then bring it into contact with the educational question and start to get more refined ways of doing the empirical work.
That's brilliant. So I'll put you on the spot. If you are designing a school to maximize trust, let's assume, right, for sake of argument, that there's, the amount of good experience, the amount of learning that happens, the quality of the education, etc., is directly proportional to the amount of trust. Assuming you can quantify trust, I don't know. Then, what would you have to do you think, to build a school to make, exploit that?
To exploit it, or to make hay of it. That's a really, really interesting. I thought you were going to ask me about how would you build it, how would you build the trust? But no, how would you then, if you've got the high levels of trust, what would you do with it? So I think that that's a really good question. So one of the things that trust gives you is it reduces the need for checks. So I'll give you a really silly example. If I trust my wife to renew the car insurance for us, I won't then go and constantly check whether she's done it. I won't be honest. I'll just, I trust you to do it. It disappears from my mind completely. Yeah. So if we trust the teachers to perform at incredibly high standards, we don't then need to be checking on that. Not checking, not auditing. We might then focus instead rather more on enhancing their practice, working with them to improve it, rather than checking those kind of minimum standards.
Yes. Does it work the other way around? So sorry, John. What I mean is, if it's the case that they are doing all that checking, can you therefore say there's no trust? So it looks like it's true the other way around, but is it true both ways?
So I think it's hard to say, if you're doing all that back checking, that you do trust someone.
Right.
So if you go back to that kind of Hawley picture where you say to trust someone is to rely on them to do it and believe they have the commitments, I think if I'm doing all of that checking and auditing work, I'm probably not relying on you. What I'm actually doing is I'm putting in place a whole bunch of infrastructure that means if you're not doing it, I'll intervene. I'll just see it.
Yeah.
And so that's going to be a much lower trust environment. And there's a lovely paper by Carol Smith in 2005 about this kind of playoff in the healthcare setting. And she's very keen on the idea, I think rightly, that where you have those kinds of infrastructure in place that allow you to do the checking, the auditing, and so on and so on, what you're doing is you're building confidence in the system. But confidence is not trust. Confidence has various different properties that make it importantly different from trust. Particularly, trust normally is associated with some kind of moral valence, moral value, normative force, in a way that confidence isn't. And so trust enables you to get away with not having to do all of that really hard checking, auditing work. That means you can free up people to actually care about the day job.
Yes, brought to mind the move in Ofsted to not, if you get, outstanding or whatever, there's not going to be as much, and OFS are doing the same sort of thing. We won't check you as much if you're doing well at least the TEF or whatever. There's at least, and I guess that speaks to that sort of approach. Maybe
it speaks to that kind of idea. What I'm not sure about is whether it's whether that's just an instance of confidence in play or trust.
Yes.
Whether they're saying we have sufficient confidence in your performance that we don't need to check you, or actually we have sufficient trust. And I think that it's open as to which of those two things is going on.
Why does confidence sound less good than trust? Just as I'm just thinking about your relationships. I'm confident in you, or I trust you. What trust? It seems much more, enriching and exciting and in life. That much more nice. That's very philosophical.
No, it absolutely does, and I think it comes back to that idea of a shared set of moral values. So if you think about trusting someone being a case of believing that they're going to relying on the man, believing they have the right kinds of commitments to do it, well, the sorts of commitments that you're going to look for in someone to do something that you trust to do it are going to be the sorts of commitments that you have. You're effectively saying, this is an upstanding kind of a person. I don't need to check on them. They have the right kinds of moral values that ensure that they will do these sorts of things. Not just moral values. Yes. Whereas if you're saying that I'm confident you're going to do it, well, that confidence could just come from the fact that there's a gun held to your head, or there's a really robust regulatory system in place that means that you have no choice but to comply. Yes. And certainly there's no implication of that moral valence in the confidence case, or the values piece generally in confidence. So I think that's where a lot of that positivity comes from around trust.
Interesting, really interesting. So, going back to the robots, do you think there's anything, we hope so, because we've got the data and we spent the time doing what sort of things are you hoping to look at in the data, or get some insights from the data about?
So what I'd be really interested in is people giving a couple of different kinds of response. So the first is, do you trust the robot, right?
Yes.
Do you trust the robot to do a particular thing? And I really, we need to see that.
Yeah.
And if I cheekily refer back to the data, here we have an interestingly mixed bag. So 12 said yes, 10 said no, and 10 said not sure. And I think that that's a fascinating distribution. And I really need to dig into the comments to try and understand why.
Yes.
And I haven't had a chance to do that yet, so need to come on to that. The other one though is I'd be really interested in betrayal. And I'm really interested in betrayal for the following kinds of reason. If you have a breach of confidence, you wouldn't normally feel betrayed. You might feel let down.
Yes.
But if you're confident that your football team's going to win and they lose or draw 1-1 in the last minute due to a goal that was never deserved, and so on and so on and so on and so on, you're not going to feel betrayed by your team. So betrayal doesn't seem to track confidence. Mm-hmm. But now think of a time where your trust was breached. So someone promised you they were going to do something and then they didn't. You're going to feel betrayed, right? Mm-hmm. And so the thought is that you can generalize this kind of thing. There's massive philosophical discussion on this. But the thought is you can generalize this. So betrayal is a really good indicator of whether or not there was this kind of rich moral notion of trust, as opposed to something which is just a bit more like reliance, a bit more like confidence. And we're just using the word trust and not really meaning it.
Yeah.
And we got a bit of data on this. So we asked, if you found out the robot had told you something false, would you feel betrayed? And the data, we need to dig in, but sort of suggests that people aren't really morally trusting the robot. So we had 8 people say yes, they'd feel betrayed, 20 said no, and 4 said not sure. And I think of all of the questions we asked, that 20 might be the highest number we got in response to any of the probes. And so that makes me think that whatever kind of relationship people are having with the robot, it isn't that kind of rich, moral, trusting relationship. It's something else that's going on. And so maybe that kind of philosophical position that says, interpersonal trust is like the thing, that's really what we should be looking at. Maybe that's actually supported by this data.
That's fascinating. It's fascinating. I mean, does that speak, do you think, to not using or being more wary of using robots in educate, given that you've said education is flourishes in context of trust, and given that we're worried maybe that this trust is not there in that rich way, do we think that we should be very, tentative about the use of robots? And then I'll ask you another added-on question, which we have no data for, and I'm just asking you to purely speculate. But do you think this generalizes to AI chatbots and things like that, rather than a sort of, because just for listeners, it was a humanoid robot shape thing. It wasn't a chatbot or anything like that.
Yeah. So remind me of the first question, because I mentioned the second one. Well, education setting, education context, should we be wary? Yes, I think we should. And I think actually some of the things in the focus groups also bore that out. That the students were fundamentally a bit uncomfortable with it. Mm-hmm. They agreed that teaching was going on, I think, for the most part. And they said that they would trust the robots, tell them the truth, and they agreed it could impart things. But they were not having, they just didn't like it, right? They were uncomfortable in that kind of a setting. And that doesn't mean that you couldn't overcome that discomfort. It doesn't mean that future iterations of the robot or a better lecture couldn't have made a difference. But it does mean, I think, that we should be wary, because that intuitive student response was not one of comfort and relaxation with things. When it comes to generalizing to other fields, here I want to almost contradict myself in what I've just said. So Robin, the robot that we used, is humanoid, you're right, but also didn't look anything like a real human. And I think it was really apparent that they found that contrivance really artificial and slightly off-putting. And I think in a world where a lot of our students and a lot of us are very familiar with online chat, text messages to each other, WhatsApp messages to each other, emails, where you don't have that kind of person-to-person interaction. I can think it might be that the sort of interaction that we have with generative AI, those conversations, those might just feel more intuitive. They might feel more trusty because we're so used to that mode of communication. And what I'm not sure is whether some of the results that we've got here will turn on the fact that Robin really does not look like a person. And they're not used to engaging with it. And so rich, robust trust isn't going to fly in that situation because we're so uncomfortable. But actually, if you did it more and more and more and more, you might become sufficiently comfortable. So difficult to know how it generalizes at the moment, but needs more digging into.
Absolutely. I think that's a really good place to pause it. I'm looking forward to looking at this data with you and with the rest of the co-maker team, and hopefully get something published soon on it.
Absolutely. I think before we go, we should thank very much the co-maker cobot team. They were absolutely brilliant. And also thank all the students who were very kind in giving up their time to engage in the focus groups, and who were the willing victims in what we did.
Yes, absolutely. We did get ethics approval, I should say that.
We did get ethical approval, but still very good of them to engage as well.
Absolutely. Yeah, great. Well, thanks very much, Jonathan. Nice talking to you as ever.
Likewise, Andy, thanks very much. And I guess that's it from us for today's podcast. Hopefully you enjoyed that. We'll be going on a little bit of a hiatus, I suspect, over Christmas. I don't know about you, Andy, but I'm not planning on having a chat with you on Christmas Day about what's going on in the world of philosophy.
Boxing Day, I thought.
Boxing Day we're on, but until next time, I hope everyone who's listening to this has a fantastic Christmas and a good New Year. We'll be back in 2026 with more philosophical insight and reflections. But until next time, it's goodbye from me.
And goodbye from me.
Goodbye, everybody.